Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy's publisher and CEO, Andrew Solinger.
Good morning. I just turned it off. Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So thank you for joining us this morning here at FP's Energy Forum. We're thrilled to have you here. I know a few people are still getting their breakfast and coming in, but we need to get started. So I'm Andrew Solinger. I'm the publisher and CEO of Foreign Policy magazine, and we're very excited to be hosting you here to discuss the energy transition. And just to kind of set the stage a little bit for you, we have shifting trade dynamics, supply chain volatility, AI-driven energy demands, completely reshaping energy priorities worldwide. Those are some of the things we're going to discuss, while at the same time fragmented regulation, shifting regional dynamics. It's complicating efforts to build consensus and come up with an approach to bring progress across regions that don't have energy access. So we want to talk about sustainability standards and elusive clean solutions. We want to talk about, again, that AI energy demand and which industries are driving change, and we have a few to talk about here today. And we've really designed this program to spark candid conversation, so I hope that's what you'll hear. We have a nice list of energy leaders, industry practitioners, government officials to talk you through some of these dynamics. And our goal is to stimulate new thinking on the topic and where the breakthroughs might come from. Some housekeeping. On your seats, you will find a card which has a couple of QR codes on it. On one side, you could just link to the agenda and speaker bios. And on the other, you can subscribe to FP, which you should do if you haven't already. It's partly how we sustain FP in addition to programs like this, and you'll learn a lot all year long, not just today. And in fact, if you subscribe, you get an awesome hat and other doodads that we have out on a table that you may have already seen. You could subscribe today and get one of those, or just prove you're a subscriber. We'll look you up on our list, and you'll receive one. So please do that. We have reporters on the ground here in New York that are here today and that will be floating around doing our special daily UNGA issue of SITREP, that newsletter, and you'll find information on it in the tote bag on your seat. So very importantly, I want to thank our partners for helping us today and supporting this program. The help of ClearPath was integral in putting this program together, and we're very grateful for them. And we also received support from the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, FedEx, and McKinsey Global Institute. A big thanks to all of them. So with that, let's get started with the program.
Please welcome to the stage International Energy Agency Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol.
Dr. Birol, thank you so much for joining us this morning at FP Energy Forum. We really are very grateful for you to kick off the program and share some insights and set the stage on where we are in energy and the energy transition.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
So the IEA was founded over 50 years ago after the 1973 oil shock. And the goal was to ensure that the world was never again held ransom to a shortage of a critical resource. And you created a mechanism to pool reserves and make sure that there was emergency oil shock cushion. And interestingly, there's a different kind of energy shock that seems to be building. And you wrote in Time magazine very recently about the challenges that countries face at the moment with critical mineral supply chains, which are incredibly important to the energy transition. And it's akin to the challenges that countries seem to be facing in 1973 during the first oil shock. Can you please elaborate a little bit about what that means to us, and what that means to IEA, and what IEA is planning to what role IEA is planning to play in that?
Thank you very much. First of all, we have to be a member of the IEA. Any government needs to have huge amount of oil stocks on the side. And these stocks are put in the market if there is a geopolitical event, such as the in 70s, we had the Middle East issues, then we had the Libya, or if there are some problems related to other supply disruptions, such as the Hurricane Katrina, which affected the oil supply here, then we bring this oil to the market, comfort the markets, and bring it back. It is still there, and we will still need it years to come. But as IEA, about 5 years ago, ring the alarm bells, we see another energy crisis looming, which is, as you mentioned, critical minerals. And these critical minerals are, as you mentioned, used in the clean energy, definitely for solar, for electric cars, the wind turbines and others. But they are also used for the drones, for the defense industry, for chips, for car manufacturing, and across the economy. So if there is a supply disruption there, not only the clean energy transition will be slower and maybe more costly, but at the same time, the entire economy may have serious problems. And as it happens today, as we see, the critical minerals have two components, basically. One is the mining, get the critical minerals out of the earth. The second one, this is a bit well known, but second one, which is not well known, is the refining. So it is like the crude oil. If you have crude oil, it is useless. Unless you refine it, making a gasoline or diesel or jet fuel or something like that. So what happens is that today one country, which is China, is dominating the game in the refining. 70% of all key critical minerals are refined in China. 30% everybody else put together. It means even though if you have the minerals, you cannot do anything. It is useless. So therefore, we drove the attention to this issue, and China is so far in front of everybody that it will be impossible to provide a diversification, which is from the number one golden rule of energy security. Diversification will not be possible unless we take some actions. And here, if we leave everything to the market, China will just dominate even more in the future. So there is a need for government efforts here. And more importantly, in my view, no country alone can provide diversification. I believe US is very important here, but also Europe, Canada, Australia, India. There, I don't say that China will definitely do something, but we have in Europe experienced the over-reliance on Russia for gas. Something similar may happen, and we have seen that, for example, China recently put export restriction for the rare earth elements, which was a big panic in the car manufacturing around the world. And DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, made the export restrictions for cobalt, again a big shake. So we are trying to understand this better, the world, and IEA is providing advice, suggestions, data to ring the alarm bells for the governments. And we are hoping, as you rightly mentioned, building a similar type of mechanism like the oil stocks as in the beginning.
Will IEA try to facilitate that amongst the 30% as you're describing, and hopefully grow it?
Exactly. Hopefully grow it, but I would say, to be honest with you, today, to be very frank, China is 10 years ahead of everybody. So we have to make up this 10 years what we are, and this is it requires extraordinary measures. And also it requires the international cooperation. We are leading this effort. From here, I will go to DC, talk with the government leaders there, and then in October, there will be a G7 meeting in Canada. I think this will be a key topic as well.
Outstanding. Well, we'll be definitely tracking that closely at Foreign Policy. Thank you for sharing. Let's talk a little bit about the transition, which is what we've been talking about, the raw materials for the transition. And IEA's first net zero roadmap in 2021 reckoned that, and we talked about this last time you were at Energy Forum a few years ago, that in order to reach zero emissions by 2050, oil consumption could never return to its 2019 pre-pandemic levels. We already blew through that, so we're back. And many now think the peak will come in the 2030s, and that's peak oil. IEA is reportedly preparing a scenario that nudges it into the 2040s based on current policies. Is that accurate?
Yeah. So first of all, one suggestion to foreign policy. This critical minerals and geopolitics are hot foreign policy issue, and will be even more so. Just to give you a small hint from my side, as a amateur reader of your journal.
You're going to get a hat after this.
Thank you very much. The second issue, oil. Now, oil demand is slowing down. Oil demand growth is slowing down. We said last year it will grow maximum 700,000 barrels per day, which is half of the pace it was growing before. And some people thought we are saying this for climate reasons, for zero. There are two reasons, basic reasons. And one is China, because China's oil demand growth is slowing down substantially. Chinese economy is slowing down, getting lighter. In the past, Chinese oil demand was growing last 10 years about 700,000 barrels per day. Now it is barely 100,000 barrels per day. Big drop in China.
They drive more EVs than they do.
Exactly. This is the second one. Electric cars. Today in China, 60% of all the cars sold are electric cars. And it is growing. And it's not only China. In the world today, 1/4 of all the cars sold are electric. Don't look at only US, the world, what is happening in China, in Europe, in East Asia. China is exporting a lot of electric cars there. It is growing. And looking at all these things, we see that the oil demand growth is slowing, and what we said last year was spot on. Some people said 2 million, some people said 2.5. We said 700, we were spot on. Now, looking at the future, I mean, this future is so uncertain, and uncertainty becomes even more uncertain every day. We are going to have in our World Energy Outlook multiple scenarios. One of them you just mentioned, and in the multiple scenarios there are different assumptions, but I think there will be different scenarios showing different pathways for energy, climate, and other things. And the report is coming beginning of November. I can't say more, but there will be different outcomes there.
Okay, great.
But the one that you mentioned, oil demand, will be still there.
Okay. Thanks for dancing around that a little bit, but we look forward to the report. How about your World Energy Investment Report is another fantastic piece of research that IEA produces. And there's a clean energy investment surge. As you mentioned, it reached $2.2 trillion in 2025, double fossil fuel investment. It's part of the dynamic you're describing. But Africa only accounts for 2% of that investment, which if you were running a venture capital portfolio, that's terrible diversification. But despite having the 5th largest population in the world, what can we do to change that dynamic?
Yeah. I mean, this is... when I look at when you understand if there's a transition, not transition, it's going back and forward, look at the money, as they say. In the year 10 years ago, the entire investment in the energy world, everything put oil, gas, renewables, nuclear, clean, everything was $2 trillion 10 years ago. 1 trillion went for fossil fuels, 1 trillion for renewables, clean energy, and others, 1 to 1. And today, fossil fuels are still 1, and all others are 2. So 1 to 2 ratio. It's a very big growth there. And mainly, solar plays a very important role here. Now, where is the problem? The problem is, there are many problems, but the main problem is the following. Of this 2 trillion investment in clean energy, 85% is happening in the Western world plus China. Yeah. 15% is happening in the rest of the world, where you have the 60% of the global population. There's a big, in decalage, there's a big gap there. So, and Africa is at the heart of it. Africa is, I give you one example. I go from here to Belgium. I look at the numbers. In the amount of solar, today it is one of the cheapest sources of electricity generation. A lot of solar electricity generated in the entire sub-Saharan Africa is equal to solar electricity generated in Belgium. Think about the map, the sub-Saharan Africa, how many people live there, and how much sun they get, and look at the Belgium.
That's terrible.
I don't know if anybody in Belgium is here, but this is not a disrespect for the country, but just to make my point here, and it is so cheap. And in Africa today, every second person doesn't have access to electricity.
Yeah.
So I find it's one of the biggest injustice in my view when it comes to the energy poverty in Africa, and therefore there is a need, concession funding and other ways to support Africans, both in terms of the access to electricity, and also there is the other hallmark of the energy poverty, which is the cooking, the clean cooking issue. I believe this can be solved so easily and such a cheap way, but if we leave it as they are, it remains to be one of the major problems in the world, in my view.
We have two. Thank you for that. We have two. I have two quick questions. Only a few minutes left, so a little speed round here. One is as you're talking about electricity investment, and investment in electricity production is far greater than investment in grids, which is one of the big issues here. What can we do to change that? It's a big problem, even in Western countries. Like the United States, lags far behind where it needs to be, especially considering the AI age.
Everywhere. So I give you one, again, sorry to mention too many numbers, but I cannot stop myself to give this number. Last year, it was the record new renewable power plants coming in the networks, about 700 gigawatts. Never happened so much, mainly solar, but also wind, others. Hydropower, geothermal.
That's a lot of gigawatts.
Lots of it. But this is not the problem. The problem is 2 times of this renewable plants were ready, finished, and they were waiting in the queue to be connected to the grid because there is no grid. It's unbelievable. The world focus on building the power plants. It can be wind, it can be solar, it can be gas, it doesn't matter. They are not, there is no grid capacity. It is something like, you love in the US the cars. You have the nicest car, the very speedy car, the very efficient car, but you forget to build the streets, the roads. Because you have the generation. Now it is starting.
We built them. It's just a long time ago, so they're full of potholes now.
But in the US, maybe you have a lot of cars and you have roads, maybe too much, I don't know. But in the rest of the world, we have forgot to build the grids. Grids is a big problem, and I very much hope that AI, artificial intelligence, which is considered as a headache for the energy industry because we need electricity, a lot of electricity for data centers. In fact, if there is no AI without electricity, I say. But AI also can help us to increase the efficiency of the grids and optimize them in a way, but we need to build grids.
It's a potential solution. Yeah. We're out of time, but I wanted to ask you one last point about the IEA itself.
Of course.
So the IEA is growing, and you're looking to expand in different countries. You're opening a new center in Asia, and a number of other countries are trying to grow the IEA family. What's the future for the organization globally?
Well, when I look again 2015 and today, 2015 IEA was considered as the oil countries, the rich oil countries club, and it is now transformed into the Global Energy Authority, and many countries joined. And recently, India and now 2 weeks ago, Brazil asked to join the IEA, and we opened a center in the as you mentioned, Singapore to work better with the countries over there. So the energy future is global. And when it comes to energy, no country is an energy island. So we look at all fuels, all technologies, and want to address all the global energy challenges. And here, coming to Africa, I have a very soft spot for Africa because we need to support Africa
Clearly,
a lot.
I'm hearing that come through. Well, we really thank you for coming and joining us today and sharing your insights. Good luck in Washington on the discussions of critical mineral supply chains, greatly needed. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Dr. Fatih Birol, IEA. Please.
Next, please welcome to the stage ClearPath CEO Jeremy Harrell, GE Vernova Chief Corporate Officer, the Honorable Roger Martella, U.S. Export-Import Bank Senior Advisor for Energy Dominance, Jeff Wilson, for conversation with journalist Maggie Lake.
Hi, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all here. Hi to everyone who's streaming and watching. Welcome to UNGA Week. It's always exciting. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here with us. I'm going to pick right up where the last panel left off. Grids, 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 right? That's what we're all going to be talking about. We know demand for energy is increasing exponentially. The question we hope to shed some light in is how are we going to finance the innovation needed to meet that soaring demand? And it's a really critical question and complex, I think, as we just heard. So, Jeremy, if I could kick off with you, what the U.S., especially now in light of the fact that it is a consumer and a seller of energy, what are some of the strategies? How can we pull together the financing, especially pull in private sector financing to help scale this and meet that demand?
Yeah, it's critical. The U.S. needs to go on offense and take a whole of government approach on how we're going to promote not only the deployment of technologies domestically, but how we promote our technology abroad to drive and assert our global strategic interests. In the end, we're never going to out-subsidize competitors like China, for example, that is effectively outspending us from a public sector standpoint 10-1 globally. But if we do leverage key tools like the Development Finance Corporation, like the Export-Import Bank of the United States, and really make targeted agreements, bilateral agreements with countries around the world to really partner and drive technology forward, we can crowd in that private sector investment and have new technologies like advanced nuclear, like geothermal, grid equipment, energy storage really take off. And that supports our supply chains as well as furthers U.S. global energy interests.
And you just ticked off a bunch of different areas that are potential investment destinations. Roger, what are the most promising? What are you seeing in terms of leading the way to attract that private investment and solve for not only scalable projects, which we know private sector investment wants, but resilience as well?
Well, I'd pick up where Jeremy left off. I think the partnership with XM and DFC has never been more important. And from our perspective, so I work for a company called GE Vernova. We're the world's energy manufacturer. We help produce about a third of the world's energy, more than half of the United States. We have 18,000 employees and 18 factories here in the United States making gas turbines, electrification equipment, nuclear, small modular reactors, and wind energy. And our purpose is to serve. We want to serve our customers in the U.S., both utilities, serve hyperscalers, but we also want to serve partners that are critical strategic allies for the United States. And I think that's where XM and DFC has been a huge partner to us, because at the end of the day, they're here to help promote U.S. interests when it comes to manufacturing. Those 18,000 people, by the way, 20,000 by the end of the year. But then they can introduce us to new markets that are aligned to the policy goals, to other strategic goals that enable energy and prosperity all around the world. If you think of these trade deals, Europe, $600 billion of U.S. energy, Saudi Arabia, the president going around the world, the Secretary of State going around the world and negotiating deals that include U.S. energy, then I think we work with you on how do we translate our U.S. manufacturing to serve those markets. And then that then leads to us creating more factories and more jobs and more onshoring and things like that. So to us, this is such a critical partnership that's great for the United States and great for our strategic partners to enable this type of prosperity, access to energy, electrification equipment.
Jeff, a lot of people looking to you for those partnerships. So break it down for us a little bit. Why, first of all, what do those partnerships look like? And what kind of finance strategies will put the U.S. in a position to sort of maintain leadership and build relations with allies, as Roger just mentioned?
I think that's the proper way to think about it. This is partnerships. It's not aid. It's not support in the traditional sense. These are opportunities for us to build economic partnerships with countries, and in doing so, to bolster the U.S. supply chain, manufacturing, and to reindustrialize the country. That's what the president's very clearly laid out as a message for the economy: is a reindustrialization, a healthier, more vibrant manufacturing sector in this country. And one of the ways we do that is to up our game when it comes to exports. And that's exactly what we're here to do. Is we're here to work with other partner countries to help put the economic heft of the U.S. into their economic systems, right? They have a choice in partnerships. And Jeremy laid this out very clearly. We're never going to out-subsidize malign actors. There are countries who want to change the economic model, and we're not going to out-subsidize them. But what we can do is we can make strategic investments. We can make partnerships that are built on economic prosperity, a shared economic prosperity, and that's what we can do at XM. And we can do that through unique financing structures. We can help American manufacturers put their projects and their products in countries that we know want the U.S. as the partner of choice.
So it's very interesting, and you can both weigh in on this. Well, what I hear you saying is we sometimes think of domestic investment and international investment. You're saying this is a situation where the benefit flows both ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's without question, when XM finances a project and we finance it in another partner country, we're doing that at the behest of the American taxpayer and the American manufacturer and the American worker. Because what we know is that those products and those jobs are ultimately going to benefit the U.S. economy and the U.S. taxpayer. We are a net positive. XM is a net positive to the Treasury. The investments that we make a return for the taxpayer, not only in terms of actual dollars back into the Treasury, but to jobs and into prosperity here domestically.
Yeah, that's super interesting. Yeah, Roger.
Yeah, if I could just echo that briefly. I mean, we're the living example of that. It's because of XM's work. Like, we'd be happy to serve the U.S. market. It's a big market. But XM's advocacy, and they are advocates for us, they're ambassadors for us, as is the DFC, it translates to more jobs, more manufacturing. As I mentioned, we'll probably add about 1,800, 2,000 more jobs to our 18 factories here in the U.S. That's attributable to the work that XM DFC is doing, the international advocacy by the State Department, by the Commerce Secretary, the kind of position U.S. equipment in markets. It's great for our jobs in manufacturing and factories. It's great for the U.S. economy. But it's great that people around the world, kids can turn on the lights and have the security of electricity. People can have prosperity. We're closing trade deficits, trade imbalances through all this. So it just checks so many boxes. I think that's healthy for both sides of the relationship.
If I could just add just one specific example. I mean, this is particularly true in nuclear, and we've seen it play out directly with XM's support of some of the U.S. developers. Building the order book not only here in the United States to meet our rising demand, but also a global order book is really critical to driving investment in the American supply chain. Even an example of when the Emiratis built the 4 reactors, the Baraka reactors, XM was supportive of U.S. supply chain companies to drive forward and meet the inputs necessary to drive those forward. And so, and that now the industry is benefiting from that because of those orders that helped us build out the supply chain, and so that we're more ready to seize this rising demand moment.
It's capacity building,
Yeah,
at its very most basic. The energy infrastructure here, it's complex, is a nice way to put it. Some people might say it's broken, in need of update, modernization, and it's because of the complications that takes time. You're trying to bring private money into some areas that have traditionally been quasi-governmental, state level. When you dive in, it is incredibly difficult. Jeremy, what can we do to increase more cooperation, interagency strategies to try to fast track what sounds like needs to happen yesterday?
Yeah, absolutely. So ClearPath is a DC-based policy organization, and so we've been working with policymakers on this concept called energy security compacts. And it's really, think about it of what, for example, the Millennium Challenge Corporation has done, but on steroids. So you really drive forward, have a lead entity coordinating U.S. government capacity to drive forward strategic bilateral partnerships. And these partnerships would have clear measurable goals, contributions from both countries that are involved, and accountability and transparency in the end. So it's fostering, as Jeff lays out, really key strategic interest. And we're both advancing each other's interests moving forward, because if we can better coordinate all these tools across the U.S. government, things like DFC, like XM, like our trade and programs, ITA programs, we really can go on offense and compete globally and win in some of the most important races that we're doing with China, the AI race, the race for global nuclear deployment, even for things like space technology that are going to be critical for nuclear propulsion, critical minerals.
Yeah. Roger, what are some of the innovations that we're hoping to attract this capital to that can help us scale to meet this needs? I know that you're on the forefront of many of these discussions.
Well, and thank you. So Jeremy mentioned one of them that's easy to roll off the tongue, which is nuclear. And so nuclear is kind of the comeback story of our time. And we're fortunate in the U.S. that we are leading the next generation of small modular reactors. We are, if you were to go 500 miles north of here to Ontario, Canada, you'd see about 400 people today actually building our first small modular nuclear reactor in the West. There's a pit about 38 meters in the ground, encased in concrete. That's where the pressure reactor vessel is going to go. And if you think about that, so lots of great opportunities for many SMR companies, but we'll be the first. And we want to be very strategic. You know, we'll only be able to produce so many so fast. How can we be strategic and where those SMRs go, not only for the North America, but around the world that meets the ambitions of the administration, so that we're making partners and allies, and frankly, we're beating China. Jeremy talked about the AI race, where there's also an SMR race. So SMR is kind of like a very critical one right now in terms of where are we deploying these in strategic ways that advance our allies, that are competitive, and advance U.S. manufacturing. I'd also just get back to basics. The world needs more electricity. As I mentioned, you know, kids need to turn the lights on and feel safe. Access to healthcare, parents need to have job opportunities. And just the ability to take our gas turbines from Greenville, South Carolina, the world's most efficient, export them to places like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, where you just want to provide core access to affordable, reliable, sustainable electricity, something Secretary Wright talks about all the time, energy poverty. And we would also be an advocate for our wind technology as well. We have 4,000 people in the U.S., Pensacola, Florida, Amarillo, Texas, Grand Forks, North Dakota, making leading onshore wind technology. And again, how you export that to places that are maybe have a good foundation of dispatchable power, but they still need more power. They have other goals. This is U.S. manufactured technology we can be exporting. So that's kind of the suite, I think, where we're looking to engage to kind of, you know, solve for both the need for dispatchable power today and the breakthroughs of tomorrow in a strategic way, like SMRs.
And could you just say a word about resilience as well? Because there's a, you know, whenever you have this massive demand, there's a tendency to move fast and break things. But it's more complicated in energy when you have to guarantee that there's resilience there, that you're not weighing on existing grids, which I know is an issue when we're talking about some of the AI demand. How does that factor in, especially when you're talking to investors and trying to pull private money in?
Yeah, and thank you for that. It's a great point. And that's why I go back to gas turbines. Like, it'd be really fun to say, oh, we're going to deliver carbon capture and hydrogen to all these countries. And we'll get there at some point. But we have to start with the basics. The world needs electricity. Electricity demand is doubling. You just heard Fatih Birol. And so we have to build the building blocks, which is dispatchable power. And today, that's gas turbines. And I would also, you know, we're looking at nuclear. And I think wind has a role to play there, too. But one thing, you know, I should mention too is electrification equipment. We make electrification equipment in the United States, switch gears and things called synchronous condensers. These are all the things that are necessary to make the grid work better, to build resiliency. And so how do we, you know, work to do more of that? I will say, unlike our gas supply chain in the U.S., unlike our wind supply chain in the U.S., our nuclear supply chain, which is up here, our electrification equipment supply chain's down here. Mm-hmm. We do some, but we should be doing a lot more. And again, DFC and XM have this critical role to play if they help us open up markets globally. we'll build more factories, we'll create more jobs, and we'll bring that U.S. supply chain up here to serve both the U.S. and other markets and grow resiliency.
Yeah, and we're talking about resiliency in energy, but also resiliency in terms of national security. This is where these two can intersect. I love leaning into where the opportunity is, because sometimes this can seem sort of an overwhelming, problem to solve as quickly as we need to. What's the role for government agencies to help de-risk? And that sounds like sort of complicated, but you're pulling private sector in. We sort of know there's interest. I hear this all the time in my conversations with investors and at investor conferences, but sometimes it's that last mile or the unknown. What's the role of government in creating a situation where investors can get up to speed and have someone de-risk? And maybe explain to this audience why that's so important.
It's a great question. Thank you for that. You heard the term whole of government approach mentioned earlier. And so it's important to understand that there are a number of tools throughout the federal government that can be deployed, XM being one of them. But we've talked about DFC here. We've talked about TDA and other parts of the federal government that can come to bear. But this isn't something that we generate on our own. This is something where we partner with the private sector, and we partner with other nations, and we do exactly what you talked about. We find the incremental value add for our ability to finance these projects that puts it over the hump, that makes it a little bit more competitive. Because what we do know is that private capital has a lot of places to go. Mm-hmm. And capital is a coward. And where we have strategic interest in having capital deployed, it's not necessarily where capital is most comfortable going all the time. And so that's the way we think about part of our role at XM is to come alongside companies like this and to say, hey, where are you having a little bit of problem with this off-taker? Where are you having a little bit of financing issue? It could be a credit risk perspective that we can't get over the hump. We can't get comfortable. Those are places where XM can really fill the gap, and where we really lean on our partners across the federal government, and we say, hey, look, this is a critical strategic interest for the U.S. government. This is a place we want to be, and this is an industry that we want to be in, and we just need to help make this happen. And there's a gap that we can fill, and it's an opportunity not to compete dollar for dollar with the Chinese, but to find that incremental place where we can really make a difference and unleash the private sector. And it all comes back to us, right? I mean, we talked about resiliency, and we talked about supply chains. We have a supply chain resiliency initiative that's built on that very premise, that the stronger our supply chain is here in the U.S., the better that is going to allow us to project power and to build this influence and to build these relationships, across the globe. We're going to enter into better economic partnerships when we are better ourselves. And there's a huge opportunity there.
I'm going to roll out that capital is a coward line many times when I'm having conversations, because that's a great way to put it. But we do take this for granted. We take energy for granted to a certain extent, especially in the U.S. when we're having this conversation, because, we flip a switch and as we heard before, that is not the case everywhere in the world. There's a lot of work to be done. Jeremy, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably not a greater example than nuclear, where we've seen this administration try to drive all the tools forward. So everything from the way the tax code ended up playing out at the end of the Big Beautiful Bill, where tax incentive well into the early 2030s remains available for clean, firm, reliable technologies like nuclear, like geothermal, energy storage, hydropower. The president has set a long-term 2050 goal and a short-term goal of over 8 reactors under construction by the end of this decade. You're seeing modernization at the NRC to improve the regulatory process so we can scale quickly. And you're really seeing the DoD, the DOE, and other entities across government find nimble ways to support early stage deployment and innovation so that we can build today and then ultimately promote U.S. technologies abroad and make sure things like GE Vernova small modular reactor is a central part of meeting our rising demand in the U.S. and an essential U.S. offering globally to meet what is now a big global 3x of nuclear goal by 2050 by over 31 countries.
Jeremy, you said something really important, and that is making sure that policy is in place into 2030. We can be short-termism here, and when you're talking about private money, we know sometimes it's quarter to quarter. How do we have to think about time frame and planning and commitments? Do we need to be playing a longer game when it comes to energy? And then, Roger, I'd like you to respond on how important that is for you as a private sector person.
Absolutely. We need to be making the investments and the reforms now to meet rising demand as soon as possible. So deploy technologies readily available today to meet that demand. But we also need to be making key investments in the technologies that we know are going to be essential to meeting that exponential demand growth, not only in the U.S., but globally. So we need a predictable regulatory system. We're strong supporters of big bipartisan permit reform here in the U.S. that has momentum. And we need to be using tools like XM, DFC, the Department of Energy's Loan Program Office to catalyze new technologies like advanced reactors, enhanced geothermal systems, long-duration energy storage.
Roger, do you feel like that is changing and that you're able to get some visibility, or does more need to be done? What would you like the audience to leave this conversation with?
I will never deny that more needs to be done, but I will say, look, we are in an unprecedented era of action right now. I've been in this space for 30 years, so probably longer than a lot of folks here in the room, just looking around. And while I've had a lot of interesting roles, I can't say that I have a lot to show for it. A lot of accountability, a lot of forward momentum in 30 years. When some things on one day, you lose them the next. Life is fundamentally different right now. We're now in a constant sprint, and every day I go to work sprinting with a big pace in my step, but then I go over to the White House, I mean, with people, and I can't keep up with them because they're sprinting faster than me, and they're telling me I'm not going fast enough. So that's frankly what we need. We need a sense of urgency. This is a historic time. For those of you who haven't been doing this for 30 years and have 30 years ahead of you, I'm really excited for you, because you're going to have the opportunity to solve some of the world's most pressing challenges. The conversation we're having today, I think, is the fact we're having is the key part of it. How do you finance it? But as Jeremy says, we have to solve what we can solve today, and we have to move fast, and we have to deliver what we can. The work on nuclear has been very positive. We're building a small modular reactor 500 miles from here. Let's just pause on that. And we'll be building them closer to here before too long. Stay by for some announcements. But the pace at which we're deploying things can always be more, can always be faster. 2,000 more people in our factories. We want to do more than that. How many more thousand will we be adding next year? So I'll never say it's enough, but I also feel admittedly optimistic that we've taken a turn and that the pace has gotten better. We are sprinting. We've got some things to figure out, but as long as we're making this progress, we're moving in this direction, I feel pretty optimistic.
If I could, I think that there is a market demand signal for building more faster now. You've clearly seen from the administration and from President Trump 4 executive orders on nuclear alone, right? I mean, energy, supply chains, more now, let's go. And that's what we take as our mission is. Our mission is to move forward faster and to not be an impediment to deploying the capital and the projects that we need across the spectrum. And so, you know, we don't want to be an impediment to this process because it takes a long time as it is. But what we also know is on the execution side, there's a significant amount of risk in the execution side. And what we know is that in nuclear in particular, some of these projects have taken longer than they should, and they've cost more than they should. And what we know is being on time and being on budget is going to be critical. And it will make financing and unlocking financing for projects so much easier when we do that. And we know that takes a lot of work. And being the first, you know, the first serial number is always the most difficult. You know, but what we also know is that the more we do this, the more we're going to be able to standardize processes and make things more modular and make the supply chains more robust, and so that we're not having to start from scratch every single time. And that's one of the exciting things about financing things like nuclear for us, is that it advances that ball and it gets us from a place of being slow and deliberative and to only getting a few projects done to really moving forward faster into growing the economy here domestically. Mm-hmm. That's the key. That's what this is really about for us, is about putting more money in taxpayers' pockets, about putting more jobs in Americans' hands, and about providing a better standard of living for the American worker. That's what we're doing, and this is exactly how we do it.
Yeah, and I know people are going to be excited to hear that opportunity because we're all looking for that, especially as technology changes some other industries. I'd like you to have the last word. What would you like, Jeremy, people to leave this conversation with?
Yeah, there's an immense opportunity, and there's an imperative that the U.S. go on an offense here. We need to enable private sector development driving forward, and that means better coordination, finding new ways to maximize what we can deploy today and with the investments that we know we need to make to meet our energy future. And so I'm excited about the opportunities. I think you're seeing immense private sector dollars being invested in this space. new companies and stakeholders investing in nascent technologies like the hyperscalers investing in advanced nuclear technologies. And I think you're seeing an administration that wants to think outside of the box, find creative ways to drive capital into these areas, and ensure the government is not a barrier to domestic deployments. And so I think it's time to lean in. And I think in the U.S. policy debate, we need experts like you all to contribute and help us push forward.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. I love ending on this optimistic note. Thank you.
Please welcome FedEx Chief Sustainability Officer and Vice President of Environmental Affairs, Karen Blanks Ellis. Airbus North America Head of Sustainability Governance, Dr. Alice de Casanova. And Airlines for America Vice President of Environmental Affairs and Chief Sustainability Officer, Kevin Welsh, for a conversation with FP's Allison Carlson.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We're thrilled to have you here. We know it's an incredibly busy week, and thank you for carving out some time for us this morning. You're all dedicated to a very important question related to how to operationalize, support the energy transition, and how to do so sustainably. I'm really thrilled to be able to share the stage with leaders in this space who are addressing one of the hardest to abate industries, which is aviation. And I'd like to dive into where we're at now and understand a little bit more both about the science as well as the practicalities of decarbonizing aviation and where we can go from here. Aviation, as well as manufacturing, tech, it's categorized as one of the hardest to abate sectors. And in order to drive deep decarbonization, we absolutely need to tackle this challenge. And so to level set for our conversation and also for our audience here in the room and online, I'm curious, as you all see it with respect to the complexity of the challenge, is it a matter of the cost of the technology or the limitations of the technology or both? Kevin, I'd like to turn to you first with Airlines for America. You're front and center of this challenge. How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, great. And good morning, everybody. So I think a couple of things on this. I mean, one is if you think about aviation, I think there are some misconceptions out there. So one of them would be, just for example, in the U.S. between 2005 and now, total emissions have not increased from the aviation sector. Yet at the same time, the sector's carried 30% more passengers and cargo. So actually, the fuel efficiency story for U.S. aviation over the last 20 years, is really good. The challenge, of course, is in the growth both in the U.S. and globally in terms of where we're going in the future and how do we manage that growth even with new technology and a good fuel efficiency story. To specifically answer your question, the hard to abate aspect, I think it's a combination, right? It's certainly the cost of technologies, the cost of sustainable aviation fuel, the cost of new aircraft and engine technologies, but it is also the availability, the safety, and the reliability, because when this sector wants to buy new airplanes and engines, we need safe, reliable aircraft that are also more fuel efficient and reduce emissions. And so that's an aspect. And then finally, time between now and 2050 is just like a quick minute in the aviation industry. So all of those lead to the challenges.
Thank you for that. Both to level set where we are and the progress that has been made thus far as it relates to tackling emissions. And I'm curious from an airline perspective and also leaders in the field. Yes, it's complex and it's challenging, but action is being taken. Karen, I'd like to turn to you from FedEx perspective. How are you looking at this challenge and how are you leaning in?
Yeah, good morning to everyone. Thank you for the question. It is absolutely, I agree, it's both. As Kevin said, aircraft emissions globally are somewhere around 2 or 3%, and yet we are still very committed in making progress on reducing our relatively small slice of the pie. But the fuel that we've been able to depend on for decades is a high-performing product. It is super high energy density, and it's very hard to find an alternative to that because we have to have that kind of energy density for these long-haul flights, for commercial flights, for you to get across the waters where you want to go. For your packages, we're delivering 17 million of your shipments a day, and we need a reliable fuel. So sometimes when you're looking at alternatives and flights are so weight sensitive, when you think about some of the fuels like hydrogen, you need a larger fuel tank. We're pretty weight sensitive. That may not today have the right solution for us. You think about batteries, again, too much weight. We're weight sensitive, particularly in the cargo space, but also in the passenger space. So we are looking at all options, and that's what we would want you to know, is that we need to keep all solutions on the table. We still need to do aircraft upgrades, but it's an asset that is 20, 30 years in a lifespan. And so it takes time not only to develop that new technology, but it's going to take time for it to be adopted into our systems as well. So I think it's all of the above. We need all solutions on the table. So if you're in a position of setting the frameworks or regulatory environments for them, please don't take any of those solutions off the table. We need all incentives, all technologies. We want it to be technology agnostic so that we can use whatever makes sense for our airline and our business in today's set of challenges.
Thank you for that. You shine a light on governance and policy tools and providing that framework. Alice, I'd like to turn to you as the head of governance and sustainability for Airbus Americas. How are you thinking about that? How are you thinking about the policy tools that are needed to develop alternative aviation fuel and sustainable aviation fuel?
Yeah, so hi, everybody. Thank you for having me today. This question, in fact, fits in the overall landscape of the decarbonization. As you mentioned, Karen, we have to keep all the options on the table. And that's not only on focusing SAF, which has very important a part to play, but it's also in supporting the development of the other technologies. And as an aircraft manufacturer, we are working on the different technologies. So decreasing the weight of the aircraft, so fuel savings. Also on the wings technology, a lot of fuel savings are coming from here. Working with the engine manufacturer as well. And we can expect, in the next aircraft generation to save 20 to 25% with this group of technologies. Of course, in terms of policy, we have to think also in terms of operations and how with the air traffic control modernization, we can also save fuel. And here we have in mind that we can reach 10% saving if we have very efficient air traffic control. So in this case, the SAF will be part of our toolkit. So any policy helping to develop the SAF ecosystem, to make it more accessible for the airline, but also, helping the certification of the future technology will contribute to the decarbonization roadmap.
Okay. And you think about the development elements of SAF, and I'm wondering if Kevin, you can speak to where are we right now in terms of SAF production and what needs to be done to increase supply. I know there's often a question about reliability of feedstocks and the sustainability of feedstocks as well, and as that may or may not relate to food security. And so when you're thinking about where we're at in production and how to scale that sustainably, what are some of the issues that are front of mind for you?
Sure. So, I mean, in the immediate term, and there's a number of different angles to this, but I think it actually was appreciating that Karen highlighted the unique nature of jet fuel and the properties it has. High temperatures, high altitudes, it is energy dense, right? And so how do you replicate that? And I would just say one thing to note is that most of the emissions from aviation, they come from flights at altitude over oceans. So that's what we're solving for, right? And so SAF is going to play an incredibly important role because we're looking at aircraft technology that's going to mature but look the same, for some time, including aircraft today. But so SAF, we went from 5 million gallons produced in the U.S. in 2021. And so far this year through August, we're at 138 million gallons produced in the U.S., as well as an additional, tens of millions that have been imported. So actually the curve over the last few years is really promising. But there's a real challenge. I would say that on the flip side, the pessimism is around whether we can keep that going, whether the big, beautiful bill and the tax credit for that includes sustainable aviation fuel, it doesn't do enough to incentivize SAF over renewable diesel and ground-based fuels. So there's a concern that we're going to hit a plateau this year or maybe even go down. And then to your point, right now, from an airline focus, there's plenty of feedstock for the near term in terms of where we need to ramp up, several billion gallons. We're seeing that produced in renewable diesel today. But long term, we've got to look at other technology sources. And I think a big announcement last week that the One World and Breakthrough Energy Ventures announced a new venture fund that's looking at those technologies further into the future, right? So we've got a lot of work to do right now just to scale SAF. And the trend is good, but there's a lot of concern and risk in the marketplace. But we've also got to, in parallel, look at the longer term technologies and feedstocks.
If we could pick up on that a little bit. As you rightly point out, there does need to be more sustainability as it relates to the frameworks and the incentives for SAF. But when we're looking at alternative technologies and other options, hybrid electric, hydrogen, where do those stand as it relates to commercialization and opportunity to leverage those other sources for your operations? Alice, I'd like to turn to you, and then Karen.
Yeah, so when we talk about hydrogen, you know that at Airbus we have the ZEROe pre-program. And last year we made a big announcement about the type of technology that we were selecting based on fuel cells. And there are a lot of technical challenges, and we have our research and technology team working on it. And we have to think also that when you launch a new program, you need 3 elements. The first one is the aircraft with all the technology bricks. You need also to get an ecosystem. What does it mean, to have hydrogen at the airport, all the refueling system, and you need a certification. So we are working on these 3 streams in parallel, and that's a very promising technology. For the battery, in the aircraft, electric hybrid, here we have to find the relevant trade-off, and it requires a lot of technology, a lot of research, and that's why we are investing, 2 billion of euros per year on research and technology.
Yeah, we certainly are highly dependent on that new technology. In fact, last year, our aircraft modernization efforts, our operational improvement efforts allowed us to save 140 million gallons of jet fuel last year. And in service to the business, that's for the finance people in the room, that was about $400 million in savings. So that's attractive in terms of the sustainability efforts, also serving the business case. But specifically, again, back to all solutions on the table, we want the aircraft upgrades, we're doing the engine upgrades, we're doing more aerodynamic selection of engines, engine upgrades. We are using lighter weight materials. So the cargo containers that are inside the aircraft, again, if you're heavier, unnecessarily moving the cargo or the passengers, you're going to burn more fuel. So lighter weight materials. But I just want to point out that we're not going to let our partners off the hook. Air traffic management needs to be improved. We are leaving a lot of emissions on the table because we're taxiing too long. We are having delays in the air and having the circle. We need significant global improvements, but certainly in the States around air traffic management. And we will advance our emissions and aspirations significantly just by making those improvements and those investments in our air traffic management controls.
If I can just to pick up, totally agree with that, and just to come back on technology. And technology has driven the fuel efficiency improvements we've seen over a long period of time in aviation, and it's an innovative sector, and that's very promising. On the other hand, I talked about what airlines are looking for and what passengers are looking for. Number one is safety, right? Number two, these airplanes not only need to be safe, they need to be certified. And unfortunately, right now in the US, there's a real challenge with certifying existing airplanes that are being produced or they're coming off the line. So we've got to work through those. And then we need reliability. And another challenge that we've seen with the latest technologies is unfortunately they've not been as reliable or durable. So when we think about the next airplane that's going to come out in the mid-2030s, I think expectations are it's got to be a lot more efficient, but number one, it's got to be safe, it's got to be certified in the time frame, and it's got to be reliable. So it places a lot of pressure on Airbus and the engine manufacturers to deliver something that's going to meet those safety expectations, but also that next level of efficiency. So it's a challenge, and again, that's why there's also a lot of emphasis on replacing the hydrocarbons in the existing aircraft and engines.
Great. Thank you. So we've talked a little bit about the integration of SAF, application of alternative technologies to reduce emissions, but offsetting emissions is also part of this conversation and an important one. And I'd like to turn to CORSIA for a moment. And for those who aren't as familiar, the Global Offsetting Program for Aviation. Karen, I'd like to turn to you if you could provide a brief explainer of what CORSIA is, and then Kevin, I'd like to turn to you about kind of where we stand and some of the trade-offs that are being discussed as moving forward with that kind of framework.
Well, at its fundamental level, it was probably one of the first times in history that 190 countries got together and said, this is how we're going to solve this particular problem for aviation in terms of emissions, right? And so it is a set of rules that applies to all airlines, which makes the competitive disadvantages disappear if all countries were to come along and implement it fully, and we fully support that. It is an opportunity for us to agree on the integrity of those offsets, the specifics inside of the carbon offset scheme that's put forward is very robust in the types of eligible offsets that we can use to offset the residual emissions that we will have. Because again, with our best efforts, with technology that we're expecting to continue to evolve, with all of our operational improvements, we will continue to have residual emissions. So we need a harmonized method across the globe because these emissions don't stop at your geography, right? So we can't have a patchwork of rules and regulations that will apply to these emissions. So this was really, I think, groundbreaking for these countries to come together on this topic to say this is the set of rules that we're all going to play by. So for multinational companies like ours, where we have about 15 million metric tons in our scope 1 to address, we have to have a harmonized way of doing that. We could not handle a patchwork of regulations across the globe that would not only be inefficient, it would waste money that we need to be investing in this new technology.
So to pick up on that, you know, the points of harmonization are really well taken, and the need to not establish a patchwork framework where different countries are pursuing different regulatory frameworks as well, and understand that some countries are pursuing more of a tax structure, taxing long-haul flights, those sorts of things. Kevin, I'd like to turn to you. How are you seeing this debate unfold and also the progress toward harmonization?
Yeah, so agree with kind of where Karen took us. Well, apart from being a really bad acronym, CORSIA was groundbreaking. And those of you in the room who've spent some time in international climate politics, here we're in New York during Climate Week and UNGA, it's really tough. So the fact that 190 states who are actually meeting this week in their General Assembly in Montreal came together to agree on an operational method to address the international aviation sector's emissions is pretty significant. That happened in 2016. A lot has happened between now and then, both to scale this thing up, but with COVID and everything, it made some challenges doing implementation, including the baseline and how you calculate. So it's very complex, but it is, for the airline sector, it is the absolutely preferred way to do that than a patchwork of taxes that individual countries may apply to aviation, because despite some saying aviation isn't taxed, it's often looked to as a piggy bank for funding all sorts of things. And so one of the things we've found in the aviation sector is it's not just one country's tax or the European Union emissions trading scheme or a proposal to charge premium passengers an additional tax. It's a whole host of things. And so if you're FedEx and you're operating all over the world, it's nearly impossible. The whole reason ICAO was founded in 1944 was to harmonize safety and standards for aviation, and they've subsequently done that for environment. So it's really critical, but it continues to be tough because we're in the world of consensus and countries having to agree to get something like this done. The very last point I'll say even makes it more complicated is the relationship between the offsets that are used and the Paris Agreement and the targets under Paris. And so right now there's a challenge of unit supply, not because the units don't exist, but because countries have to go through a process to make those units available for CORSIA and take them out of their national reduction targets.
Great. With all of that said, and we just have a couple minutes left, we are here alongside Climate Week and the backdrop of the UN General Assembly with a real opportunity to move the dialogue and collaboration forward, understanding that it is a matter of cross-sector collaboration in order to drive progress from aviation, finance, energy, agriculture in some instances. And so from each of your perspectives, what do you hope is achieved this week to really enable forward movement that we all need? Alice, I'd like to turn to you first.
I think that we have a successful story with the Minnesota hub. So Airbus is a partner of Delta in this story, where you have a group of stakeholders with Delta. You have Deloitte, you have Ecolab, Bank of America, and altogether what they have put in place is a local ecosystem in Minnesota where they have local feedstock to produce SAF. They have this local support of the state, and they use the SAF in Minneapolis Airport, which is an important hub for Delta. So if we can replicate, this local ecosystem, I think that here maybe we have find, magical recipe to support the development of the SAF ecosystem. So it's really, think global with CORSIA and act local.
Excellent.
I agree with that. I think since we're here in UN Week, I think we need to remember why we're doing this work in the first place. There are communities, there are geographies being impacted every day. And so we don't have time to rewrite the book, throw out all the levers we have today. We need to use those levers, refine them, course correct along the way, accept those course corrections are going to be necessary as we evolve. But we need to make every step along the way to solve the problems and use all the tools, whether it's carbon credits, whether it's new technology. Let's not discount any of it, because the problem is just exacerbated as we delay decision-making in action.
Absolutely. And Kevin, you want to bring us home?
Well, I'll just add the great points. I mean, there has long been a business imperative to address the environmental impact of aviation, so that's not something new. I think that continues to provide momentum, and in this turbulent and changing political environment, it's really refreshing to see that there's this continued commitment from the aviation sector to move towards its goals.
Great. Thank you. And thanks again to all of you for your interest in this issue. This is a real opportunity to drive forward those kinds of collaborations this week and going forward. So thank you all for sharing your expertise and for your partnership.
Please welcome to the stage Overture Ventures co-founder and managing partner, Shomik Dutta, Duke University's Nicholas School of the Environment James B. Duke Fellow, Tyler Norris, and Environmental Defense Fund Associate Vice President for Innovation and Technology Policy, Natasha Fidangos.
Hello, everyone. Hello again. Thanks for staying with us. I imagine a number of you are very interested in the topic we're about to dive into, which relates to AI, data centers, and sustainability. We're finding ourselves at a moment in history where there's a tremendously rapid build-out and demand for data centers, which is absolutely important for economic development, advancement, et cetera, around the world. But it's also creating a number of complex challenges as they relate to energy supply, reliability, community development, sustainability, and whether or not rapid build-out of AI, which, according to some estimates, in the next 5 years may double globally and reach the energy demand of some small nations. So this is no easy task to address. But in this rapid build-out, there's also a real question about undermining or compromising our sustainability goals. And so as the demand for energy from data centers in particular is increasingly voracious, how can that be met in a sustainable way? And so excited to share the stage with experts in the field to be able to, learn more from you and from your expertise in what can and needs to be done to ensure sustainable and reliable energy in this AI moment. Tyler, I'd like to turn to you first. We hear in, every day in different news articles, different reports, projections about what energy demand is going to look like from AI and from data centers in particular. And while there is some incredible modeling being done, the truth is estimates are a little bit all over the map. And so I'm curious from your perspective how you're looking at that from an analytics perspective. And then we can dive into what that really means in terms of investment and project development.
Yeah, sure thing. Well, thanks for having me here. So the current forecast is that U.S. peak load will grow from somewhere around 700 gigawatts to approximately 850 gigawatts by the early 2030s. So just call it roughly 150 gigs. And then you need to add a little bit of reserve margin on top of that. So it's the fastest pace of electricity load growth since the 80s. And I think sometimes we hear comparisons like, well, we expanded the power system really fast in the 60s and 70s. Surely we can do the same now. But the thing that sort of discounts is that we have much higher permitting restrictions now. We have much less land availability. We have much higher population density. And we have much higher demand for reliable electric power service and decarbonization. So there's so many more pressures. So even if you wanted to do all of that peak load growth by supplying it with gas, there just aren't enough gas turbines, and so we've heard this story. But it's a little unclear what the gas turbine supply is, but let's just call it 60 to 80 gigawatts by the early 2030s for the U.S. So you still have a gap when you add a reserve margin of up to 100 gigawatts. And so the question is, how are you going to meet that? And what we're interested in on some of our recent research is how can we bring the demand side of the equation to contribute a little bit, and also perhaps the demand side via flexibility can help to offset some of that need for new peaking resources. But we'll get into this more, but the real crunch is on the ability to supply more capacity on peak. There's plenty of energy in the system, but it's all about these finite number of hours where you need to supply the most extreme swings in demand during extreme weather.
Part of that supply question is obviously related to investment and project build out as well, in addition to the optimization that you're talking about and be able to provide reliable energy at peak. Shomik, I'd like to turn to you from an investment perspective. How are you thinking about these challenges?
We're proceeding cautiously. It feels like in any commodity bubble, when you hear things like obviously and certainly, it is never the case that those things continue up and to the right forever. And so I think we're in a classic period of overbuild. We've seen this in past infrastructure super cycles like railroads and in fiber in the 90s. And so I think the reality is, in part, thanks to sort of first principle thinkers like Tyler, there is more than enough capacity that we can find in our existing system if we learn to flex demand. And we have made, I think the environmental movement has made the last 30 years largely about slowing things down. And the kind of liberal proceduralism we see now, especially hyper-locally, is impeding our ability to electrify faster. And I think it is exceedingly difficult to understand how we're going to meet load by being able to count on us breaking permitting, breaking interconnection logs. We have 2.5 times the electricity generation of America stuck in clean energy projects that are built, ready to interconnect today and cannot. New projects are being told they can't connect until 2032. And so this is a big policy challenge that, as an investor, I think is a logjam that is difficult to see how it is severed quickly. And as a result, I kind of joined Tyler in trying to find opportunity in the distribution node and in flexing demand, and being cautious of the fact that I think at some point this overcapacity, hundreds of billions of dollars in CapEx spent, will have to confront the fact that OpenAI has 10% gross margins, and we have yet to find a truly profitable AI startup. We have a lot of revenue ramp with potentially negative gross margins, and I think all of this is going to come to roost soon.
Yeah. Natasha?
I'll just add on to that really quick, just to help people understand. I mean, the scale of load requests in some jurisdictions, as you alluded, I mean, in some cases, it's 2 or 3 or 4, even 5 times their existing maximum peak demand. So even with the most aggressive possible version of permitting reform that you could imagine, it is physically impossible to build out the system fast enough to meet that amount of load. And so in that kind of environment, it's like something has to give. And either some of that load can go elsewhere, it can disappear entirely, or it can flex. And so we'll get more into that discussion.
Thank you both. I think it's important to level set, right, about the complexities and challenges. And like you said, the most aggressive permitting won't enable us to get there to address the demand. But also, you mentioned the number of clean energy projects that are not yet connected and not efficiently integrated into a system. And so, Natasha, I'm curious from your perspective, how are you looking at that complexity, both in terms of meeting AI-driven electricity demand, but also being able to do so in a way that is consistent with, or at least advancing, sustainability goals?
Yeah, no, I think it's not very contentious to say we have to find a system that works. We need to solve this problem. And right now we're at a bit of a crossroads where there is a very real possible worst case scenario where we build all the wrong things and we take all the wrong lessons. So if we find ourselves only building fossil and squelching innovation and reining in anything that is not the sort of old 1950s style baseload power meets the demand right where it is, we will very potentially saddle ourselves with high consumer costs, more pollution, more water stress, more opposition to this whole revolution that everybody's talking about trying to enable. On the flip side, there are some very real challenges with the power system that we've been facing for a very long time. It's not a new thing to want to bring more sustainable power onto the grid. We've been working very hard to find the ways to do it. And some of this comes down to new, exciting models for innovation for how we use the grid more flexibly. Some comes from building more clean. Some comes from finding more ways to get more efficiency out of the system so we get the maximum value out of our resources as we have them. But this is the moment where taking just the 2 to 5 year view and just thinking about how we solve this for tomorrow misses the fact that our emissions are still going up. Our climate risk is still going up, and we are going to be living with those risks, not in the 2 to 5 year time frame, but over the course of the lifetime of the assets we build today. So this is a real opportunity for us to be intentional about where we want this energy transition to go.
and to get ourselves to the place where we want to be, not just in 2 years, but in 30 and 50 going forward.
The long-term trajectory is absolutely important, especially as it relates to thinking about investments in the near term, but also the challenge is incredibly, and need is incredibly urgent. And so I'm curious, when you think about the kinds of technologies that are deployable now and can be applied to the grid for greater efficiency, optimization with transmission so there isn't as much energy loss, I'm curious, what are sort of the biggest bets, or where do we need to lean in now in the next 3 to 5 years to ensure that strength of the system and optimization of operations so that over the longer term, those energies can be, and alternative generation forms can be developed, but we also need to act now. So I'm curious, Tyler and Shamik, what are you thinking about in that regard?
Yeah, I think what's remarkable is when you realize how little we actually use the power system. I think we've all become accommodated to this notion that the grid is completely maxed out. All we can do is just put a lot of investment into more infrastructure. And by the way, we do need to do some of that. But when you look at the average utilization rate of the existing power system in the US, we use it about 53% of the time. So that means that on average, in any given hour, half of the power system sits unused. And the reason for this, right, is we build the entire system to accommodate the maximum peaks in demand, which generally occurs somewhere between 50 to 200 hours a year on any given system, depending on its particular load profile. And so there's kind of this great news story out of this, which is that outside of that 50 to 200 hours, there's a lot of headroom on the system. And actually, we could add a lot of new load while mitigating or deferring the need for more expenditure on infrastructure. And so the whole sort of challenge becomes, how can we get new load or existing load to be a bit more flexible? And so when we ran the numbers, we found that, if the new loads, and let's just call it data centers, with sort of a constant load profile generally, if they were able and willing to be flexible or curtailable for 0.25% of their maximum potential uptime in a given year, that across the US we could add 75 gigawatts of new load, which is kind of on the upper end forecast for the data center portion of that load growth I mentioned. And so this is a great opportunity. Now, it's sort of easier said than done, and we have this notion that they need 5 nines reliability. That's actually not utilization rate. Their actual capacity utilization rates are more like 50%, which is sort of another topic. But so there's so many different technologies that can help us do that. Battery storage, I think, is going to be a big one. That could be on-site at the data center, or it can be distributed across other portions of the system. Grid enhancing technologies, topology optimization, dynamic line ratings, advanced power flow control. There are so many emerging ways to get more kilowatt hours out of the existing grid. And so we can get into more detail on that front. But I think we just have to recognize, too, that the way we incentivize most of our investor-owned utilities is exactly the opposite of getting more utilization out of the existing system. We know this, but we need to be clear about this all the time, that the way we incentivize the load-serving entities is by how much capital expenditure they can put into the system. And I think that's going to have to change, because we just cannot accommodate this amount of load growth, especially in a sustainable way, unless we're able to get more utilization out of the system we've already built.
I'll put a finer point on it to be even more blunt. Investor-owned utilities in America are not to be trusted. They are the antithesis of what is good for the consumer. They have requested $39 billion in rate increases last year. 1 in 6 Americans today are more than 3 months late on their electricity bills. And they're compounding at eye-watering CAGRs. And if you're a wealthy, coastal elite, you don't spend much time looking at your utility bill. But this is just fundamentally unfair to ask someone's grandmother to pay for a gigawatt data center. It's hard to articulate the public interest here on that topic. And so this is a point that I think we need to carry forward to more American consumers. And there needs to be an energy freedom campaign that is launched that can capture the American imagination on a bipartisan basis. And I think it's a real opportunity politically to take this on. I think it's hard to overstate how much, can I say the word fuckery, is in some of these rate tariffs. And so it's something that I think we need to consider. It's interesting. In American politics today, trust is at an all-time low. Trust in academics, trust in elected officials, and there's an opportunity to jujitsu this in trust in utilities, who have about the same NPS as a cable company in America. And as these rate increases compound and these investor-owned utilities continue to work against the American public interest, I think there's an opportunity to break them. And there's an opportunity, instead of spending $20 billion a year on gas peaker plants, there's an opportunity to pay that back to the American consumer who can flex their demand, pay that back to the small business owner who can use their batteries at strategic times. And I think this is an amazing opportunity to finally align. Everywhere in the world, it feels like working class, non-college voters are fracturing, and we're seeing a sort of return to nativism and blood and soil language and some scary stuff. And this is actually an opportunity to align with working class Americans on an issue that I think is fundamental to the clean energy transition as well.
Yeah, I'll just say that I agree with part of the load serving entities, utilities, they play a vital function, and because we are so dependent on electricity. And I think they respond to the incentives we give them. So I think actually we kind of, as the public and our policymakers, bear some of the responsibility because we've given them a set of incentives that motivate them to pursue this kind of behavior. And so I think if we change their incentives, they'll behave differently. And that's sort of on all of us to sort of make sure we go more in that direction. But ultimately, I think the idea is to have them be more aligned with the public interest through better incentives. And they're going to play an absolute crucial role in all of this.
Yeah, I would completely agree. And I would just say the ratepayer issue is a really important one to bring up. And it is acutely affecting families, communities, especially where, projects are being built, and it needs to be addressed. So I appreciate you putting a fine point on it, and it is an opportunity. The ratepayer question isn't just in the U.S. I mean, it's happening around the world, and it's this issue that does require greater policy alignment and being addressed proactively, because it can be, in some cases, destabilizing for individuals, their families, but also from a social perspective. And it's related to these complex challenges of what are those models that can reorient and optimize and really focus on the opportunity to think about that system a little bit differently and the fundamentals that underpin it. And so I'm wondering if we can turn to some examples of what is working. If obviously the problem has not been solved, but what are some of those fundamental systemic shifts, policy changes that are happening that are addressing some of these challenges, dealing with ratepayer issues and the utility structure, but also responding to communities? Natasha, I'd like to turn to you. There is activity. I know there's activity in Oregon and Washington State and some progress being made. And so I'm wondering if you could shine a light on that. What are examples that we can learn from and lean into so that this more systemic change can happen?
Yeah, it all makes me think a little bit of a very old song that when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object, something's got to give. You can imagine that the tech sector in this is kind of that unstoppable object, and the utility sector is kind of the immovable force. And we're at that moment where a lot of conversations are being forced to the top. There's not only one way to solve this, and there's so much diversity in the way we do power across the United States and across the world. The tech sector may be global, but the power sector is very local at the end of the day. But the common themes are ones you've heard already, which is we can get a lot more efficiency out of the system. The less we need to build, the less we need to rate base. We help keep those costs down. The more we're able to really ensure that we're using as much efficiency, using innovation to try to ensure demand stays as low as it can be to get the most value out of it. We also really need alignment. I really like Tyler's point there, because that's something that's just incredibly costly at the end of the day. When you don't have alignment among the incentives with such a wide array of stakeholders that need to be orchestrated to make this work, it gets complicated, it gets wasteful, and it doesn't work the way you want it to. So really, those cases where you have the greatest success are where you have the alignment with the policy, the regulatory framework, the voice of the communities all represented in a way that gets things moving forward.
Great. In the few minutes we have left, I want to take the opportunity to hear from each of you about what is needed then to advance this work cross-sectorally and collaboratively to make that change. I mean, and candidly, what isn't being discussed that needs to be in order to make that impact. I feel like we're in a space here with those who are coming from the investment community, energy generators, policymakers, and others. And so if you were to spotlight one key issue or one key area that really needs to be leaned into, what would that be? Shomik, I'm going to turn to you, Tyler, and then Natasha will close out with you.
You know, it's funny. I think everyone acknowledges how much of the U.S. economy right now is just leveraged to the Mag 7, to these high-margin, astonishingly large hyperscalers. And they're not just holding up the U.S. economy. It feels to me like increasingly they're actually holding up a lot of our climate objectives, because but for their Microsoft's participation in carbon removal, but for their commitments to net zero, it's not clear to me how we'll be able to keep advancing things like small modular nuclear reactors and geothermal at the rate that Microsoft and Google are willing to pull them forward. And so I think some of this is also like institutional shareholder pressure on making sure that none of these hyperscalers walk away from their net zero commitments. Because if they do, citing national security, for example, in a race against China, boy, that could be troubling in this moment. And so my answer is like nothing to do with my venture job in my day job. It's actually a lot about like, wow, we're super fragile to like 6 companies that are doing great work, and we need to sort of hope and pray and encourage them to continue doing that, because it holds up the entire ecosystem that I'm looking at least on the venture side.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, well, there are many levels of change, I think, but just to kind of go with the theme we've been focused on here and building on those comments, I think it will make a very significant impact for the future of the electric power sector if some of these large loads can demonstrate the ability to be a bit more flexible. And so that's why I think it was so significant that Google announced its flexibility contracts in early August with 2 U.S. utilities, the first of their kind. Why I think companies like Veris are very important, because they are developing a wholly new flexible data center architecture, and other startups, including GridCare, Emerald AI, others that are trying to figure out this problem. We've never really done it, but if we can't figure out how to make these large loads a little bit more flexible, I worry that we're going to have a massive overbuild of new natural gas capacity that not only is going to stay on the system for decades, but could also it could crowd out some of the clean, firm technologies that we really need to start scaling in the 2030s, right as they're being able to be commercialized.
Great. And Natasha?
Maybe just the final point that there are some really exciting things that are very new in this story. I'm really excited about demand flexibility. I'm really excited about the innovation that's happening in this space. But not all of the solutions are new. Some of them are really just rigorous, robust, good policy to move towards sustainability and give greater clarity to the sector. So we can't lose that thread. It's very easy in all the excitement to say this is a completely new story. Actually, it's just the next chapter in how we achieve decarbonization of the power sector and that longer-term goal.
Great. Thank you all for your commitment to the issue and your candor today. I think it's through that and through those ideas and insight that we'll be able to make progress. So thank you for being with us here today.
Next, please welcome to the stage McKinsey Global Institute partner, Dr. Mikala Krishnan, for a conversation with journalist Maggie Lake.
Hi again, everyone. Wow, I learned a lot from that last panel. That was a fantastic conversation. And I think we've heard so many different perspectives so far today. And so maybe that's why, Michaela, it's good to sort of take a step back for a moment before we unpack a little bit of that and just level set, where are we in the energy transition? How are we doing?
Yeah, so disclosure, I'm an engineer by training, so I love data and numbers, so I'm going to throw some data and numbers at you. I'm also an engineer by training, so as I answer that question, I want to talk about some research that we did that took stock of the energy transition, but took stock of it not from a dollar standpoint and not from a policy standpoint, but literally where are we in terms of building all the things that we need to build. Because at its core, the energy transition is a physical transformation. We need to replace all this actually quite high-performing energy infrastructure that we have today. Fun fact, oil and gas pipelines today extend the distance from the Earth to the moon and back twice. That's how much energy infrastructure we have today. So we need to replace all of that. And we're trying to do it in the span of decades, right? So we wanted to look at this from a physical perspective. So as we did that, a few things stood out to us. Firstly, we've made a lot of momentum, and we've seen already a lot of that in the conversation today. You know, solar costs come down, lots of solar deployment, et cetera. But we're at very early stages of this energy transition. We've only deployed about 10% of all the technologies we would need to have deployed by 2050 to meet Paris Agreement goals and fast transition scenarios, right? So we're 10% of the way there. There's 90% of the job to be done. And so then we asked ourselves, okay, so what is that 90% going to take? And we came up with a blueprint of 25 things. I'm not going to enumerate all the 25 things, but it's 25 things that are about building things and making sure that they work. So examples of that is, what do we do in terms of periods when the sun doesn't shine and wind doesn't blow? How do we deal with intermittency of renewables? How do we scale up critical minerals infrastructure? How do we build EV charging stations? How do we get heat pumps to work in extreme cold weathers? That was the sort of thing that we cataloged, all physical things. And what was really interesting, you know, you got all these vibes about the transition. What was really interesting is we did that when we said, okay, we're 10% of the way there. We want to get to 100%. There's these 25 things that need to be done. We then said, okay, how many of those 25 things that need to be done are relatively easy execution challenges? How many of them are much harder innovation challenges where we still don't have technologies that perform quite as well, where there's massive interdependencies, lots of scaling to be done? And we came up with the number that was about half of emissions sits in the first category of challenges, things where it's an execution challenge. This is debottlenecking the grid, scaling up critical minerals, really hard things, but it's about executing, doing things we know how to do, but doing more of it, doing it better. And about half of energy-related emissions sit in these much harder challenges where it's a massive innovation challenge. How do we decarbonize things like steel and cement? How do we get hydrogen to work? How do we get carbon capture to work? And so that was really interesting to see. It's half and half, because it gave us a sense of finding a way to figure out what does policy actually need to do, and where does it need to be execution-oriented, and where does it need to be innovation-oriented.
And I think that's amazing, because we just heard a conversation, and so helpful to have that simple framework, because we just heard a conversation when we're talking about we have the capacity there. We're just not either connected or using it at the right time. We need flex. That sounds like something that at the surface of it could be counter, but actually just falls into the we can do it, we can improve on it. What do governments need to, and industry, private sector need to focus on in addressing the really hard things? Or I suppose, how do they go about sort of two-speeding this?
Yeah, I mean, I always describe this as you need to walk and chew gum, unfortunately. Yeah. Like, we need to actually do both things. It's very interesting when you look at this half of energy-related emissions that I described in the relatively easy things. I mean, these are not shiny objects, right? This is not like the, really attractive new investment area. And I think, unfortunately, as a result of that, we actually haven't seen as much investment go into that. We did an analysis that looked at all the emissions reduction that can come from things that cost less than $20 a ton of CO2, like really cheap things. And we're investing 5%, 10% of what we would need to invest in these things. So there's some amount of this that is just basic blocking and tackling that unfortunately is not that exciting, and so doesn't get all the attention. I think for the innovation challenges, it's really important to think about the word innovation really carefully. So when I say innovation challenge, I imagine everybody's thinking about innovation in a lab, some kind of R&D exercise, getting a technology to work better, getting hydrogen to work better, getting carbon capture to work better. And that is certainly a part of the innovation challenge. We need to get technologies and their performance to improve. But I think the other part of the innovation challenge is what I describe as innovation not just with a small I, but innovation with a capital I. And that's what I think about as system innovation. So if you think about these sorts of challenges, these are areas where the technologies don't work as well. We're at very early stages where we've maybe deployed, I described the 10% on average. We've deployed 1% or less of the technologies that we would need to have deployed. We really have no execution track record with these challenges. And in some cases, there's a fundamental physics or chemistry limit to how well these technologies can work. So carbon capture is an example of that, where the moment your CO2 emission stream gets more and more dilute, remember I said I was an engineer, it gets more and more dilute, it gets harder to capture that carbon, right? And so technological innovation can get you so far. You can get better chemistries, do better absorption, but at some point you also need to think about system innovation. And what I mean by that is you need to think about either being very selective about the use cases that you're applying these technologies to, not thinking they're a silver bullet that goes everywhere. Hydrogen is an example of that, by the way. People used to talk about it as the Swiss Army knife of the transition, and now people are realizing it's the sushi knife of the transition, meaning it's in very selective use cases you need to think about it. So you need to think about use cases carefully. Sometimes you need to really think out of the box and think about actually changing how you deploy technologies entirely, right? So an example of that is trucking, where we're hearing from a lot of the companies we work with. You can think about electric vehicles for trucking, and electric vehicles, by the way, in trucking have become much better. But you can also think about changing trucking routes so that charging becomes easier. You can think about alternate forms of transportation. So you really do need to think out of the box and not just on that one small I innovation, but also capital I innovation.
As I'm listening to you, and this really helps structure this conversation, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, okay, we know private sector investment is really important. They want a unicorn and to make them, to find the next big company. So of course they're going for the sort of extreme innovation as opposed to that lower hanging fruit, which you say is, we have the answer already. How do we have to think about financing in order to get money to those easier solutions that can help move the needle quicker while still funding maybe that long-term breakthrough company that's going to, solve cold fusion or fission or whatever is going to get us there?
Hopefully somewhere soon. Look, we need a lot of financing for this transition. We've estimated that today the world spends about $5.7 trillion, that's a trillion with a T, on a variety of energy and land use systems. This is everything from building gas power to building solar power to internal combustion engine cars. So $5.7 trillion today. Going forward for the energy transition, we need to spend about $9.2 trillion. That's a step up of $3.5 trillion versus today. Now, some of that is we're just going to grow our economies going forward. We're going to use more energy. But some of that is that this is a capital-intensive transition, right? We're building a lot of things, as I said at the beginning. And so we need to figure out how to get capital to flow. Now, as we've looked at that $9.2 trillion, what we estimate is that about 70% of that could come from private capital, 30% of that, maybe 40% of that from public capital. And so firstly, it's important to think about both forms of capital. It's not one versus the other. Public capital is important to de-risk. It's important because there are cost competitiveness gaps relative to between low and high emissions technologies. Also, in some parts of the world, public capital is what funds these sorts of infrastructure projects, right? So we need public capital, but we also need private capital. To your point about what forms of private capital, I think part of the problem has been we focused a lot of the conversation on venture funding as one form of private capital, and we actually need all forms of capital to come into play. We need venture funding, we need private equity, we need companies to spend from their retained earnings. We need that messy middle, which is actually where a lot of these technologies fail in the scale up from just pure idea to, on the scale of pure idea to commercial maturity. There's a massive messy middle, and we need new forms of capital for that messy middle. So I think about all forms of the capital stack needing to play a role.
Yeah, and again, if we have a framework to plug it in, the conversations get easier and the goals don't seem as competing or not aligned, and we just heard the need for alignment. We're almost out of time, but really quickly, we talk about AI in terms of supply. Can it help in terms of the answer, providing the answer? Can we leverage that to speed things up?
Yeah, so there's, of course, AI to help the sustainability agenda, things like grid optimization, new material discovery. That's one part of the conversation. I want to leave you all with a different part of the conversation, which I actually take a lot of optimism from. So if we think about AI and energy demand, I mean, we talked about various estimates of that. Whatever you believe, the numbers are 5, 10, 15% maybe at most of electricity demand coming from AI by 2030. Let's contrast that to electricity demand from the energy transition. If we are to achieve our net zero 2050 Paris Agreement goals, any guesses on how much electricity demand would rise relative to today by 2050? Okay, so it's 300%, right? So AI, 10, 15% by 2030, 300% by 2050. So the good news version of this story is that all the problems we would have to encounter anyway to scale up electricity generation by 2050, which is how do we get the grid to work? How do we reduce interconnection queues? How do we manage flexibility issues? These are all issues we would have to deal with anyway down the road, and we're dealing with them now because we're trying to figure out how to get AI to work and how to scale up electricity demand from AI. So that's my glass half full view. Problems we would have to deal with anyway down the road we're dealing with today.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much, Michaela.
Thank you.
This is why I love engineers.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Foreign Policy's publisher and CEO, Andrew Solinger.
Hi, everyone. There I am. We have a bit of a surprise today for you. We were meant to have the Danish energy minister join us for a talk. But unfortunately, he couldn't make it. However, we got an upgrade. We are very excited to have Ambassador Ali Tunke. He is not only the relatively new, from the beginning of the year, Ambassador for Climate in Denmark, but he's also the Undersecretary for Development Policy and is going to be able to cover a wide swath of issues for us. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Tunke. Please proceed. First of all, this speaks very well for partnerships with the Danes. They don't let you down, and no matter what happens, they come through. I really appreciate your making the time for us. It's wonderful, and we were just chatting about some of the things we were going to discuss with the minister, and we're going to be able to cover so much more. So thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
No, thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for that intro. I think it's the first time I've been talked about as an upgrade from the minister.
So you could tell him I said that, by the way. That's totally fine by me. Denmark has been a real bright shining star and a model for the green transition from oil dependency in the 1970s. We were just discussing my conversation with Dr. Barol of the IEA earlier. That's how the IEA was created after that oil shock. Denmark said, not only that, we're going to change the model for Denmark altogether and reduce that oil dependency and become a world leader in wind power and the clean energy innovation overall. You have shown, Denmark has shown that political will and driving public buy-in as well and smart policy can really reshape an entire energy system. And I'd like to ask, just at the top, what's the most important lesson, and it could be more than just one, but what's the most important lesson we can draw from the Danish example from that transition?
I think what happened in 2019, we had what we in Denmark call our climate election, because climate was actually on the top of the agenda for the voters at that time. So the government came in really with a strong notion of doing something ambitious about the climate. So they very rapidly did a policy saying we need to reduce by 70% in 2030. So there was really a strong political will to be extremely ambitious, and it was a broad-based political will in Denmark that has ever since actually been very, very strong. So that around, we want to really make a strong push. The government even said at that time 70% in 2019 was like extremely ambitious, and they said we don't even know, we don't have the technology to get there now, but we'll set the ambitious target and then we'll work it out as we go along. So one, the strong political will, and then two, what they did was that they said we can't do this alone as a government, so we need all partners of society to join hands with us in order to achieve this goal that we don't know how to get to. So they formed 14 partnerships with the private sector and the civil society and the research institutions for each sector that had any sort of CO2 emission. And each of these sector dialogues was chaired by oftentimes a CEO from one of the big Danish companies working in the private sector in the green transition. And they came out with, I think, 400 very concrete recommendations on how do we actually get there. And that has formed like the basis for how do we in Denmark actually get to go to 70%, which now this year, actually, for the first time, our independent climate council has said that it actually looks like you're going to make it.
So that is really impressive. And the takeaway I get is not just to set the BHAG, the big, hairy, audacious goal, but to bring everybody along with you, create their ownership of that goal. Exactly. And it's not something that we're pushing down, but everyone's going to help build up. Is that a way to look at it?
Exactly. And I think that's a strong lesson that you need to engage everybody to push this agenda, because it's a change agenda. I mean, we are changing from a fossil fuel system to a renewable energy system. And in order to make changes happen, you need to involve everybody.
Let's talk about some of those private enterprises and some of the elements of this transition. So Denmark has been a pioneer in offshore wind, putting some of the blustery weather conditions to work. And now more than, I understand, you probably have a better data point on this, but about 50% of Danish power electricity comes from either wind or solar. Danish company Ørsted, which is majority owned by the government now, has transformed itself from an oil company into a wind company and exports wind. And in fact, it is a wind champion that has tried to is constructing wind operations here in the U.S. Very nearby, actually, in the Northeast. We have lots of wind operations out west. But offshore, water-based windmills. There's a project that is, off the coast of Long Island and off the coast of Rhode Island that was actually blocked by the Trump administration, which seems to have this antithetical position to wind power. And my question for you is, why is that? What do you see as the role for offshore wind globally, and why the resistance? And not to get political with Trump, but why is there this resistance to what seems to be the perfect clean energy source?
I think what has happened, because when Denmark started this wind turbine adventure, if I can call it, way back in the 70s, because we were hit by the oil crisis, wind turbines was really expensive, and the Danish consumers have paid a lot of extra costs to get that new type of energy into our system. But as years has gone by, this technology has really developed, and now actually the renewable energy technology is superior to fossil fuel-based technology, period, being it wind turbines or solar power, or being offshore, onshore. And obviously when you have a technological shift at a global level, with a new paradigm, there will be winners and there will be losers, and everybody needs to adjust to this new system, because it's a better deal. So obviously there will be, any types of changes again requires that everybody is on board, because there will be winners and losers. So I think that's what we are seeing now at a global scale. This thing playing out.
You had mentioned to me earlier also that there is a mandate that Denmark has enshrined in law about global presence, about spreading this renewable energy momentum globally. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
We have actually, what the government did was to also do a climate law of Denmark, setting out what we will do in Denmark, but also mentioning that, yes, Denmark is only 0.1% of all global emissions. So if we are to have a real impact at a global level, we need to also be active at a global level. And since we have been first movers on the wind technology, and we actually have, I think it's 65% intake of renewable variable energy into our grid. So we have a lot of technology of how do you actually do that in practice.
Which is the real drawback on renewables like solar and wind.
Exactly, but it's doable. So what we are doing is that we are sharing that technology at a global level with all countries that are moving in this direction, which again, all countries are right now, because it's a better technology. So we have with India, we have a strong technical collaboration where the Danish engineers working on the Danish grid, making that function to a 99.9% availability, working with the Indian engineers of how do they put together their grid in the best possible manner to make sure that they can also have a higher intake of either solar or wind power into their system.
It sounds like you're putting your development undersecretary hat on. Is that part of your development plan in Denmark? And I know you have a new plan that you've just drafted as well.
Yeah, that's part of it. Part of that story. Another part of that story is also the financing part. Denmark is there. and also the adaptation parts, which is very important for many of the global south countries, also in Africa. So we're also very active on that.
So it's a principal part of that development plan, which is great. I wanted to turn to grids. We were talking about that a little bit earlier today in a few different discussions with both Fateh Birol and ClearPath. Many countries struggle with permitting and grid integration. How did Denmark overcome these bottlenecks?
I think, there's a lot of challenges. It is not easy. And I think we've been on this for 30, 40 years. And we've learned a lot of lessons along the way. And clearly, every time you get an extra percentage of renewable variable energy into your grid, you need to do some changes. You need to do some inventions. You need to do some investments to make sure that that is doable, and at the same time having a stable grid, because that's, first and foremost, the most important thing. So it's like a never-ending story, and it's something that is evolving right now, the technology, but it's really moving. What we are so blessed with in Denmark is that we have a collaboration with our neighboring countries called the Northern Power Pool.
Yeah.
So when there's not too much renewable energy produced, we get hydropower from Norway, for instance, to balance out the system. So the whole key in this is that you need to work and collaborate with your neighbors to make sure that you have a stable grid for everybody, so that when we have really good winds, we export very cheap energy to our neighboring countries. And when we have low winds, we import from them to balance it out.
This seems to kind of counter also one of the knocks on this success is that Denmark's a small country, so it's a small grid. But in fact, you cooperate regionally, so you're a much larger region.
We couldn't
do it by yourself.
No.
Maybe we could turn to other types of new energy, renewables. Where do you see Denmark's role in areas like green hydrogen, carbon capture, industrial decarbonization?
I think these are some of the new technologies that are coming. I think we have to, just like we did with the wind industry, we need to put in investments for the technologies to be competitive. We are working a lot on carbon capture and storage right now, because it's ironically, you can actually store some of the carbon into the old oil and gas fields in the North Sea. But again, it's like an infant industry kind of problem. So you need to start it out, and you need to do some trial and error. And then the hope is that in 5 to 10 years, this technology will actually be compatible and needed, because if you look at the figures on what do we need to do on climate change and reduce CO2 emissions, we need some of these technologies.
Yeah, most definitely. So it's good that you spread your bets. Since you're future casting, and we only have a minute left, it would be great to get your take on where you hope Denmark will be on energy and climate in 5 years' time, let's say, 2030. I won't take you out too far, but help us to understand what you would hope Denmark would achieve, and you could even broaden that out globally, where you expect and hope we'd be.
I'm very confident that now, again, as I mentioned before, with the green technology now being superior to the fossil fuel technology, this really huge shift globally will happen. The question is, how fast will it happen? So my hope is that we really double down on building the grids of Europe, interconnect, and get full throttle on the electrification of Europe to make us energy independent.
And how about in Denmark specifically, which has been in the vanguard leading? Will it continue to be the example, the shiny example for all of us to follow?
That we also have developed some of these new technologies, as you mentioned, of carbon capture, but also the hydrogen power to X technology, getting that also on the seas, etc., is a clear hope.
Great. Well, I really want to thank you so much for sharing your insights on Denmark's great work, and a little bit about your development portfolio, how climate and development work together. And we really appreciate you sharing those insights. Thank you so much for all the good work that you do. Please join me in thanking the ambassador for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again. I'm just going to close here for a moment. That wraps up our, I could just stand here. I have my microphone on. That wraps up our Energy Forum. Thank you so much for sticking around. A couple of quick things. I just wanted to mention, first of all, a few of the things that I learned along the way from these discussions around just as we discussed, balancing climate goals with security and affordability. The importance of public and private collaboration in achieving these goals. Innovative financing is key. We talked about sustainable aviation. I thought that was a fascinating discussion, talking about tough sectors, hard to abate, and how to decarbonize and the breakthroughs we're making there. AI was throughout the discussion, talking about those needs and how we need to power the AI revolution. And as we were just, Mikhail was just saying, it's actually a fraction of what we'll need overall for the green energy transition. And of course, Denmark's experience and those invaluable insights and what we could share globally. So thank you for those of you who are in the room and those of you globally who logged on digitally. And a big thanks again to our strategic partner, ClearPath, without whom this wouldn't be possible, and for the support from the Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, FedEx, and McKinsey Global Institute. We have other UNGA programming taking place this week. We're going to take a break for an hour or two, and we will reconvene here with our Tech and AI Forum. More discussion on AI. Isn't that in every conversation? If you haven't registered, or if you're not sure you're registered, please see our front desk. That program is full, so you can't just hang out and attend, but we would love to have you join us and double check if we can get you in there. You can see our full slate of events at forumpolicy.com/events. Thank you so much for joining us. And subscribe. Don't forget to subscribe.